Etched, it started with a single missing line buried deep inside the revised Coronation archives, a line palace historians swore had existed only days before. Queen Camilla's name, once permanently etched beside King Charles III in official ceremonial records, had quietly vanished. No public statement, no explanation. And according to insiders, Prince William himself authorized the change during a tense late-night review at Kensington Palace. What looked like a clerical adjustment soon triggered whispers of an internal royal purge, unlike anything seen since the abdication crisis. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, almost nobody noticed. Deep inside the labyrinth of royal administration, edits happen constantly. Dates are corrected, titles are updated. Formal language shifts quietly from one version to another. But this was different. Palace archivists reportedly froze when they discovered that several ceremonial references connected to Queen Camilla had either been minimized or removed entirely from portions of the official coronation documentation tied to the sacred records of May 2023. According to royal correspondents familiar with the situation, the changes were not accidental clerical revisions. They were deliberate, surgical, and perhaps most shocking of all, they were allegedly approved at the highest possible level by the future king himself. The timing could not have been more explosive. King Charles III, already weakened by months of growing health concerns since early 2024, had reportedly become increasingly absent from several internal palace operations. While public appearances continued under carefully controlled conditions, insiders whisper that the machinery behind the monarchy had quietly shifted into succession mode long before the public realized it. Meetings became smaller, conversations became colder, and somewhere behind the sealed walls of Kensington Palace, Prince William allegedly began reviewing what aides described as legacy-sensitive materials tied directly to the future historical framing of Charles's reign. That phrase alone sent shockwaves through royal circles, because within the House of Windsor, legacy is not symbolism, it is power. The official records of a coronation are treated almost like sacred constitutional scripture, preserved for generations inside the institutional memory of the crown. To alter them quietly after the fact was viewed by some historians as almost unthinkable, yet reports suggest precisely that may have happened. And even more chilling were whispers that palace aides had been instructed not to discuss the revisions publicly under any circumstances. The silence itself became suspicious. Veteran royal journalists began hearing fragments of the same story from entirely different sources. One correspondent allegedly received confirmation from an archival assistant. Another reportedly heard concerns from staff connected to ceremonial planning offices. By the end of the week, insiders claimed several senior historians had quietly contacted one another behind closed doors, trying to determine whether the edits represented routine modernization or something far more deliberate. What frightened many of them was not simply Camilla's disappearing references. It was the pattern emerging around them. Because according to those familiar with the palace's internal restructuring, this was happening alongside a broader tightening of institutional control around Prince William. Administrative reviews have reportedly intensified. Access to certain historical materials became restricted. Long-serving aides connected to older royal factions were said to be increasingly sidelined. And looming over all of it was the ghost of Queen Elizabeth II herself, a monarch whose final years were defined by meticulous legacy planning and an almost ruthless commitment to preserving continuity above personal emotion. Now, some insiders believe William may be following that exact doctrine, not out of cruelty, not out of revenge, but out of a growing conviction that the monarchy must be carefully reshaped before the next reign officially begins. And if that is true, then the quiet disappearance of Camilla's name may represent far more than a historical correction. Because insiders claim this wasn't about paperwork alone, it was the opening move in a much larger battle over who would define the monarchy after Charles. The sun-drenched coronation of 2023 was presented as a triumphant new chapter for the House of Windsor. But behind the gold carriages, sacred oaths, and ancient rituals, palace factions were already quietly preparing for something darker. The inevitable struggle over King Charles's legacy. According to reports now resurfacing, Prince William never fully accepted the expanded role Camilla claimed during those historic ceremonies. For the public, the coronation was meant to symbolize stability after decades of turbulence. It was the final transformation of Camilla from the most controversial woman in Britain into queen beside the sovereign himself. The palace worked relentlessly to shape that image. Every appearance, every title, every carefully selected phrase carried enormous emotional weight. After years of scandal, public hostility, and whispered resentment lingering from the Diana era, the institution needed the ceremony to succeed. And on the surface, it did. Crowds gathered. Ancient traditions unfolded with precision. The monarchy appeared united beneath centuries of ritual and history. But according to palace insiders, unity inside the royal walls was far more fragile than anyone realized. Because while King Charles reportedly viewed the coronation as the culmination of a deeply personal journey, others inside the institution allegedly saw it as the beginning of a dangerous imbalance. Reports suggest several members of the old guard grew increasingly uncomfortable, audible with the scale of Camilla's ceremonial prominence during preparations leading up to May 2023. Some insiders allegedly feared the palace was moving too aggressively to secure her legacy within the historical framework of the monarchy itself. And within those quiet tensions, Prince William's concerns reportedly began to harden. According to royal correspondents familiar with private discussions at Kensington Palace, William believed the monarchy needed what aides allegedly described as streamlined optics moving into the next generation. The phrase sounded harmless on paper, but behind closed doors it carried enormous implications. Because in royal language, streamlined rarely means smaller alone. It means controlled, disciplined, focused entirely on the direct line of succession. And according to insiders, William worried that the institution risked blurring those lines by elevating Camilla's symbolic role too deeply into the permanent historical narrative of the crown. The conflict reportedly became even more sensitive because of Queen Elizabeth II's final wishes. During her final years, the late monarch publicly expressed her desire for Camilla to be recognized as queen, an etched consort. But insiders claim interpretations of those wishes varied dramatically within different royal circles. Some viewed Elizabeth's decision as an act of duty designed to stabilize Charles emotionally during the twilight of her reign. Others allegedly interpreted it far more narrowly as acceptance for Camilla during Charles's reign only, not as an enduring expansion of institutional power around her wider network. Those conflicting interpretations quietly lingered beneath the surface long after the coronation ended. And then came the growing whispers about influence. Not public influence, internal influence. Palace administrative streams reportedly became increasingly divided between traditional loyalists, connected to Queen Elizabeth's old structure, and figures perceived as close to Camilla's circle. According to insiders, even seemingly minor appointments inside ceremonial offices, archival departments, and household operations became sources of tension. What frightened some members of the institution was not Camilla herself, but the growing belief that her presence had begun extending too deeply into areas traditionally protected by rigid constitutional hierarchy. That fear transformed the coronation records into something far larger than historical paperwork. They were viewed as sacred institutional documents, official memory carved into the monarchy's permanent foundation. To alter how future generations would interpret those records meant influencing how history itself would remember the reign of Charles III. And as more questions surfaced about who truly controlled that narrative, the atmosphere inside royal circles reportedly became colder, sharper, and increasingly distrustful. Because beneath the polished unity presented to the world, competing visions of the monarchy's future were already taking shape. And as Charles's health reportedly worsened behind palace walls, those tensions evolved from quiet disagreements into bureaucratic warfare. By early 2026, whispers of a secret alliance inside the monarchy had grown impossible to ignore. Palace administrative streams, ranging from security reshuffles to archival audits, pointed toward what insiders allegedly called the Heirs Accord, a coordinated effort led by Prince William to reclaim control over the crown's future before it was too late. At first, the signs seemed disconnected. A scheduling chart, here, a cancelled advisory meeting there. Certain aides who had once enjoyed direct access to key ceremonial discussions suddenly found themselves excluded from sensitive conversations involving succession planning and long-term institutional strategy. But according to sources familiar with internal palace dynamics, those moves were not random. They were part of a deliberate restructuring quietly unfolding beneath the public surface of the monarchy. And at the center of it all stood Prince William and Princess Anne. For years, Anne had operated as the monarchy's iron-willed enforcer, protecting royal protocol with a level of discipline even senior courtiers found intimidating. She rarely sought headlines, rarely entered public controversy, and rarely lost internal battles. That was precisely why insiders claim William increasingly leaned on her guidance as Charles's health struggles intensified behind palace walls. Reports suggest their alliance deepened rapidly during late 2025, particularly as concerns grew over what some aides privately described as institutional drift surrounding Camilla's expanding influence. The future king, according to royal commentators, no longer viewed the situation as a temporary family disagreement. He allegedly saw it as a long-term threat to the monarchy's structural balance. That fear triggered what insiders now describe as a silent counteroffensive. Senior aides reportedly began conducting internal reviews of ceremonial records, constitutional references, and historical documentation tied to Charles's reign. Publicly, the palace maintained complete silence. Privately, however, whispers of legacy preservation protocols began circulating through royal administrative circles with increasing urgency. The phrase carried an unmistakable chill, because within the House of Windsor, preservation has never simply meant protection. It means control over memory itself. At the same time, Camilla's allies allegedly began noticing subtle but unmistakable changes. Several figures connected to her household reportedly found themselves excluded from future planning discussions tied to major royal events. Invitations became narrower, access became tighter. Even long-standing advisory structures inside Clarence's house were said to be quietly reevaluated. According to insiders, the atmosphere became deeply tense, with many aides terrified, aligning themselves too openly with either side. The palace had entered a dangerous new phase one where loyalty itself had become politically risky. And then came the legal dimension. Reports suggest advisors connected to the Duchy of Cornwall were quietly consulted regarding constitutional optics, succession sensitivities, and the preservation of institutional authority during periods of royal instability. That development alone reportedly alarmed several veteran courtiers, because the duchy has historically functioned not merely as a financial entity, but as a strategic power center surrounding the heir to the throne. If William's team was seeking legal guidance there, insiders feared it signaled something far more coordinated than routine archival maintenance. Royal commentators soon began speculating about William's deeper concerns. According to several palace observers, the prince allegedly feared the rise of what some insiders described as parallel influence networks operating around the crown, unofficial circles of influence capable of reshaping royal priorities outside the traditional line of succession. Whether those fears were justified remains unclear. But what is CL? My ear is that the atmosphere around Charles reportedly became increasingly strained as pressure mounted from every direction. Because at the center of this escalating conflict stood an aging king already weakened by illness and emotional exhaustion. Charles reportedly remained deeply loyal to Camilla, determined to protect the woman who had endured decades of public hostility beside him. Yet at the same time, insiders claim he understood the growing anxieties of William, Anne, and the institutional old guard. He was trapped between love and legacy, between personal devotion and the brutal demands of monarchy itself. And as tensions quietly hardened behind palace walls, even longtime royal staff began whispering that something much colder was now unfolding beneath the surface. Because the real shock came when whispers emerged that the archival edits were only one part of a much colder operation already underway. At first, staff believed the changes were routine. A guest list adjusted here, a ceremonial briefing rewritten there. But according to insiders familiar with the palace's administrative machinery, a far more devastating pattern soon became impossible to ignore. Queen Camilla's a network inside the institution appeared to be quietly shrinking, and Prince William's fingerprints were allegedly everywhere. The transformation did not arrive with dramatic announcements or public dismissals. That was what made it so unsettling. Inside royal households, real power rarely moves loudly. It moves through access, through silence, through who suddenly stops receiving certain phone calls. According to palace insiders, that exact process allegedly began unfolding in slow motion throughout early 2026. Long-standing figures connected to Camilla's circle reportedly found themselves increasingly isolated from sensitive planning discussions tied to the monarchy's future. At first, many dismissed it as temporary restructuring caused by King Charles's health struggles. But as weeks passed, the pattern became harder to explain away. Several staffing reshuffles reportedly altered the balance of influence inside ceremonial and administrative departments that had once operated comfortably around Camilla's orbit. According to sources familiar with internal scheduling operations, aides who had previously participated in high-level coordination meetings were quietly reassigned or removed ID from strategic planning chains altogether. No scandal, no public conflict, just an icy procedural efficiency that many inside the institution found deeply unnerving. The message, according to one royal commentator, was unmistakable. The future structure of the monarchy was already being redesigned before Charles's reign had even reached stability. What made the atmosphere even colder was the tone of the communication itself. Staff insiders described internal correspondence as increasingly rigid, formal, and emotionally detached. Gone were the softer diplomatic phrases that traditionally masked royal tensions. In their place came concise procedural directives focused on streamlining institutional continuity and preserving historical consistency. To outsiders, the language sounded harmless. But within palace walls, many interpreted it as bureaucratic warfare disguised as administration. And looming behind those changes was the growing influence of Princess Anne's famously unforgiving management style. For decades, Anne had earned a reputation inside royal circles as the monarchy's ultimate defender of discipline. Courtiers reportedly referred to her methods privately as the iron protocol, a system built on precision, loyalty, and absolute institutional hierarchy. Now, according to insiders, comparisons between Anne's administrative philosophy and William's evolving strategy became impossible to ignore. Royal historians were allegedly instructed to standardize future references tied to ceremonial documentation and succession-related materials. Again, the wording sounded technical, but historians inside the institution reportedly understood the deeper implication immediately. History itself was being carefully reorganized. The tension escalated dramatically following a series of highly private meetings at Sandringham. According to multiple media insiders, those gatherings brought together senior members of the Royal Old Guard alongside advisors connected to William's household. Officially, no details ever emerged. Unofficially, whispers spread rapidly through palace circles that difficult conversations had taken place regarding the monarchy's long-term public structure after Charles. And once those meetings concluded, the shifts reportedly accelerated. Certain ceremonial duties traditionally associated with Camilla's office were quietly reassigned. Mayoral appearances were allegedly scaled back or restructured. Even trusted allies within her broader advisory network reportedly began finding themselves increasingly excluded from conversations about the crown's future direction. For Camilla, insiders claimed the growing isolation became impossible to ignore. After decades spent fighting for legitimacy inside the institution, she had finally reached the pinnacle beside Charles during the coronation of 2023. Yet now, according to those closest to the situation, she allegedly felt the walls tightening around her once again. Reports suggest she became furious over her exclusion from key strategic discussions tied to future planning, particularly as William's influence inside the monarchy continued expanding at remarkable speed. But by then, palace tensions had reportedly evolved far beyond ordinary family disagreement. This had become a silent struggle over legacy, control, and survival itself. Yet according to those closest to the situation, the most explosive confrontation had not happened publicly but behind the sealed doors of Clarence House itself. Sources close to royal staff say King Charles appeared exhausted, emotionally torn, and increasingly isolated as the conflict intensified around him. For years he had fought to secure Camilla's acceptance within the institution, but now, with his health under relentless scrutiny and Prince William preparing for the future, the king reportedly faced an agonizing reality. The monarchy might survive only if Camilla's role quietly faded into the background. For decades, Charles had endured humiliation, criticism, and public resentment in order to protect the relationship that eventually brought Camilla beside him to the throne. Long before the coronation, long before the carefully orchestrated rehabilitation of her public image, there had been years when many believed such acceptance would never happen. Yet Charles persisted through scandal after scandal, convinced that history would eventually soften toward them both. That belief became the emotional center of his reign. And perhaps that is why the growing fracture inside the palace reportedly wounded him so deeply. Because according to insiders, this was no longer a battle against hostile newspapers or public opinion. It was happening inside the monarchy itself. Sources close to royal operations claim Charles, much of early 2026, attempting to calm tensions between competing factions growing increasingly hostile behind closed doors. On one side stood Camilla and those still fiercely loyal to her role within the institution. On the other stood William, Anne, and senior figures tied to what insiders described as the monarchy's long-term stabilization strategy. Charles reportedly tried to mediate carefully, hoping to preserve unity without humiliating the woman who had stood beside him for years. But the deeper the conflict became, the clearer it allegedly became that compromise itself was starting to disappear. According to royal commentators, William framed his position not as personal opposition toward Camilla, but as a matter of institutional continuity. That phrase reportedly surfaced repeatedly during internal discussions surrounding succession planning and historical preservation. To William and those aligned with him, the monarchy's survival depended on absolute clarity surrounding the future line of authority. Any perception of competing influence structures inside the crown was allegedly viewed as dangerous during a period already overshadowed by uncertainty surrounding Charles's health. And behind William stood two powerful allies whose influence inside the institution carried enormous weight: Princess Anne and Prince Edward. Anne reportedly remained unwavering in her belief that the monarchy could survive only through discipline, restraint, and strict adherence to constitutional hierarchy. Edward, quieter but deeply respected inside palace operations, was said to support efforts focused on protecting the institution from future instability. Together, they worked together to achieve a common goal. Insiders claim they formed part of a growing internal consensus that the crown's future required careful recalibration before William eventually ascended the throne. For Charles, however, those conversations reportedly carried devastating emotional consequences. Because every move toward stabilization seemed to push Camilla further toward the margins. Reports suggest Camilla became increasingly frustrated as ceremonial reductions and strategic exclusions continued unfolding around her. Invitations narrowed. Consultations diminished. Even discussions surrounding future legacy planning allegedly proceeded without her involvement. After finally achieving the title and status she had spent decades fighting, to secure, insiders say she now feared watching her influence slowly evaporate in real time. And perhaps most painful of all was the growing sense that Charles himself could no longer fully shield her from the machinery of the institution. Royal experts began quietly speculating that Charles's greatest fear was no longer personal scandal, but constitutional instability. The monarchy had already survived years of crisis involving Harry and Meghan, public distrust, and growing debates about relevance in the modern era. The last thing Charles allegedly wanted was another visible fracture inside the royal family, while his own reign remained physically vulnerable. That fear reportedly forced him back toward the doctrine Queen Elizabeth II had embodied throughout her life: duty over self, the institution first, personal emotion second. It was a principle Charles had struggled with for decades. Now, insiders believe he was being forced to confront it more brutally than ever before. And as tensions surrounding the Coronation archives escalated into a symbol of the monarchy's uncertain future, many inside palace walls reportedly realized the conflict was no longer truly about records, titles, or ceremonial wording at all. It had become a painful transition of power unfolding quietly before the public could fully see it. And in the end, insiders say the removal of one name from one document revealed a truth the monarchy could no longer hide. For decades, Camilla fought one brutal battle after another for legitimacy inside the House of Windsor. From public hostility in the 1990s to the coronation throne beside Charles, her rise seemed complete. But according to royal observers, the quiet removal of her name from official ceremonial history may have exposed her deepest fear all along that acceptance inside the monarchy was never truly permanent. Long before the coronation crowns, before the carefully orchestrated public rehabilitation campaigns, Camilla existed at the center of one of the most painful chapters in modern royal history. For years, she was portrayed not as a future queen, but as a symbol of division surrounding Charles and Princess Diana. Public anger followed her relentlessly. Headlines turned her into a permanent target. Even within royal circles, insiders claim there were periods when many believed she would never be fully welcomed into the institution. Monarchy, Yet somehow, through patience, survival, and Charles's unwavering devotion, she endured. Slowly, the hostility softened. The palace adjusted its strategy. Public appearances became more controlled, more sympathetic, more disciplined. And eventually, after decades of turbulence, Camilla achieved what once seemed impossible: recognition beside the sovereign himself. That victory, however, may never have fully erased the insecurities created during those earlier years. According to royal observers, Camilla allegedly understood better than almost anyone how fragile royal acceptance can be. Public criticism could be survived. Newspapers eventually moved on. Scandals faded with time. But historical erasure inside the institution itself was something far more terrifying. Because within the House of Windsor, survival is not measured only by titles held during life. It is measured by how history chooses to remember you after power has shifted elsewhere. And now, insiders claim, that fear may have returned with devastating force. The controversy surrounding the Coronation archives reportedly struck at the very center of that anxiety. According to sources familiar with royal historical operations, debates quietly emerged over how future ceremonial references tied to Charles's reign should be standardized moving forward. To outsiders, such discussions sounded procedural. Inside the palace, however, they carried enormous symbolic consequences, because every adjustment to official language influences how future generations interpret royal legitimacy. And according to several commentators, Prince William's focus appeared increasingly centered on what advisors allegedly called direct hereditary continuity. That phrase has become critical to understanding the deeper struggle unfolding behind palace walls. William, insiders suggest, reportedly views the monarchy's long-term stability through the lens of bloodline clarity and institutional discipline. In that framework, the future narrative of the crown must revolve overwhelmingly around the direct line of succession stretching from Queen Elizabeth II to Charles, then to William and George. Some historians now speculate that Camilla's symbolic prominence inside official historical records may have begun conflicting with that long-term vision, not because her role lacked importance during Charles' trial, but because the institution itself allegedly fears anything that complicates the monarchy's carefully managed hereditary narrative. Royal historians have reportedly become deeply divided over how future generations will frame Camilla's place within the royal story. Some argue she will ultimately be remembered as the woman who brought stability and emotional support to Charles during decades of personal difficulty. Others quietly believe her prominence may gradually diminish over time, much like certain royal consorts from earlier centuries whose influence once seemed enormous before slowly fading into historical footnotes. Comparisons to previous consorts reportedly surfaced during internal discussions, particularly those whose ceremonial significance declined rapidly once a new sovereign took control of the institution's narrative machinery. Meanwhile, media outlets have begun cautiously questioning whether the archival controversy represents something much larger than a temporary palace disagreement. Reports increasingly suggest the monarchy may now be prioritizing institutional bloodline continuity over personal loyalty in ways not seen openly for decades. That possible Monarchy carries painful implications not only for Camilla, but for Charles himself. Because after everything sacrificed to secure her acceptance, the institution may now be signaling that no victory inside the monarchy is ever fully permanent. Power changes, priorities shift, and history itself is often rewritten by the next reign, not the current one. Yet as unsettling as these developments appear, insiders whisper that the deeper transformation may still be coming. Because the final stage of William's reported strategy may not concern Camilla alone, it may redefine the future image of the monarchy itself. Insiders whisper that Prince William no longer sees himself merely as heir to the throne. He reportedly sees himself as the architect of a complete royal reset, a colder, leaner, tightly controlled monarchy built to survive a hostile modern era. And according to those watching palace movements closely, the coronation record controversy was only the visible tip of that transformation. For years, William publicly projected patience, discipline, restraint. He understood the weight of waiting beneath a reigning monarch whose life had already stretched across decades of royal history. But, according to palace insiders, something began shifting dramatically once King Charles's health struggles intensified. The future king reportedly stopped thinking in terms of temporary adjustments and started thinking in terms of permanent structural survival. In private, Royal commentators claim, William allegedly became increasingly convinced that the monarchy could no longer operate through emotional compromise, overlapping power circles, or loosely managed symbolism. The institution, as he reportedly sees it, must become sharper, smaller, and almost ruthlessly controlled if it hopes to survive the political and cultural storms of the modern age. That philosophy appears to be reshaping nearly every aspect of the palace's internal direction. Reports suggest William has quietly prioritized institutional discipline over personal diplomacy in ways that sharply contrast with Charles's more emotional and often conciliatory style. Administrative operations linked to succession planning have allegedly become more centralized. Public messaging reportedly passes through narrower channels. Even ceremonial appearances, according to insiders, are now increasingly evaluated through the lens of long-term image architecture rather than short-term popularity. To William's supporters inside the monarchy, these moves represent strategic modernization. To critics, they feel chillingly corporate. But either way, the transformation appears very real. The so-called slimmed-down monarchy strategy that once sounded like an abstract future concept has reportedly accelerated significantly since Charles's illness became a central concern behind palace walls. According to royal experts, William allegedly believes public trust in the monarchy can survive only if the institution becomes more visibly focused on the direct line of succession and less dependent on sprawling royal networks. That means fewer competing personalities, fewer blurred hierarchies, fewer unofficial centers of influence surrounding the crown. And within that evolving structure, one figure appears increasingly central to the monarchy's future image: Catherine. Insiders claim the Princess of Wales has become a stabilizing symbol around which much of William's long-term strategy is quietly forming. Calm, disciplined, and widely respected across generational divides, Catherine reportedly embodies the type of control, continuity William believes the institution desperately needs. Palace observers increasingly note how official narratives surrounding the monarchy now focus heavily on the future trio of William, Catherine, and Prince George. Historical symbolism, once spread across broader royal dynamics, appears to be narrowing toward a more direct hereditary storyline designed to reinforce institutional clarity. That shift may explain why figures perceived as outside that future framework, including Camilla, have reportedly experienced a gradual reduction in strategic visibility. At the same time, insiders whisper that significant administrative modernization is unfolding quietly behind the scenes. Legacy systems tied to ceremonial operations, archival management, and communication structures are allegedly being reevaluated under William's influence. Royal commentators describe the prince as increasingly decisive, particularly compared to Charles's more emotionally layered approach to monarchy. Where Charles often sought reconciliation, William reportedly seeks control. Where Charles tolerated ambiguity, William allegedly views ambiguity itself as dangerous. That contrast has become impossible for palace insiders to ignore. And perhaps nowhere is that contrast more visible than in the handling of Camilla's evolving position inside the institution. According to royal observers, her diminished visibility may not simply reflect personal tension or temporary restructuring. It may instead represent part of a much broader succession preparation strategy already unfolding quietly around the future reign. A strategy designed to transition the monarchy away from emotionally complicated chapters of the past and toward a more tightly curated dynastic narrative centered entirely on the next generation. If that is true, then the archival controversy was never truly about a missing name alone. It was about the future shape of royal power itself, about who controls memory, who defines legitimacy, and who ultimately decides which figures become permanent pillars of history and which slowly fade into ceremonial shadow. And as the palace falls silent once again, one question now hangs over every corridor of Windsor. The monarchy has survived wars, scandals, abdications, betrayals, and funerals draped in silence. But history often turns not on public spectacles, but on quiet deletions no one notices until years later. A missing signature, a vanished title, a name carefully removed from the permanent record. And according to royal insiders, that may be exactly what makes this moment so chilling. Because for all the grandeur surrounding the House of Windsor, the institution has always understood one brutal truth better than almost any other power structure on Earth. Memory is control. Kings may reign publicly, but history is shaped privately. Deep inside royal archives, inside carefully preserved letters, ceremonial records, succession documents, and rewritten narratives, the monarchy quietly decides how future generations will remember the past. That is why whispers surrounding the alleged removal of Camilla's name from portions of the coronation records have unsettled so many observers far beyond ordinary royal gossip. To some insiders, it represents far more than an administrative adjustment. It represents the machinery of legacy itself beginning to move. Throughout history, royal institutions have repeatedly reshaped public memory in moments of transition. Titles disappeared after political collapses. Portraits vanished from corridors after dynastic fractures. Sir, my central to power slowly faded from official emphasis as new reigns established their authority. Rarely does the institution erase openly. Instead, it recalibrates carefully over time, reducing prominence little by little until history itself begins to soften around the edges. And according to royal commentators, that is precisely why the current controversy feels so psychologically powerful. Not because the alleged archival changes are dramatic on their own, but because they suggest a much larger shift quietly unfolding beneath the surface of Charles's reign. At the heart of that shift lies a philosophy William reportedly embraces with increasing conviction. The crown is not personal property. It is a sacred trust held for the nation, protected temporarily by each generation before being passed forward. Supporters of the prince insist his actions are not motivated by cruelty or revenge toward Camilla. Instead, they frame the strategy as an attempt to preserve institutional clarity during one of the monarchy's most fragile modern transitions. To William's allies, the tightening of historical narratives, the narrowing of symbolic focus, and the growing emphasis on succession all represent preparations for survival in a deeply uncertain future. Yet even among those who support that vision, uncertainty continues surrounding Camilla's long-term place inside the royal story. Officially, she remains queen beside the sovereign. Publicly, the palace maintains its familiar silence. But insiders whisper that silence itself has become part of the drama. Every cancelled appearance, every reduced ceremonial role, every subtle adjustment inside palace operations now fuels deeper speculation about what is truly happening behind closed doors. And as those questions grow louder, Charles's reign increasingly appears overshadowed not by what he built but by what comes after him. That may be the most tragic dimension of all. Charles spent decades waiting for the throne, fighting for personal acceptance, and defending the woman he loved against extraordinary public hostility. Yet according to observers watching the institution evolve in real time, the monarchy has already begun orienting itself emotionally and strategically toward the next era, toward William, toward Catherine, toward George. The future has started pulling focus away from the present reign, while Charles still sits upon the throne. And in that reality lies the coldest lesson the monarchy has always understood. No individual, no matter how powerful, ever stands above the institution itself. Now the palace remains quiet once again. No official confirmations. No dramatic declarations. Only whispers moving through royal corridors, archival rumors spreading among historians, and a growing public fascination with what may or may not have been altered behind closed doors. But perhaps that silence is what makes the story feel so haunting. Because when institutions built on centuries of survival begin quietly reorganizing their own memory, the consequences are rarely visible immediately. They emerge years later, hidden inside the version of history future generations inherit as truth. And maybe that is why this moment feels larger than one missing name or one disputed document. It is about legacy, about power, about the brutal tension between personal devotion and institutional survival. The monarchy endures precisely because it adapts without emotion when necessary, even toward those once considered untouchable. And according to insiders watching this transformation unfold, the House of Windsor may already be preparing for a future in which difficult chapters are softened, simplified, or quietly pushed into the shadows for the sake of continuity itself. Because inside the House of Windsor, power is never truly lost in public, it disappears quietly, behind palace walls, one name at a time. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.